are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and I'm here every Tuesday to talk about business history. Military history, doctrine, and leadership, and draw from that lessons that we can apply to our businesses and professional practices. So I'm going a little bit offbeat today, you might say, especially for a Jewish guy. But a while ago, I read a book called Alpine Elite, German Mountain Troops in World War II. So, obviously, during World War II, Germany was ruled by the Nazi regime, and they controlled every aspect of life. It was a socialist government, so this is not revisionist history of the Nazi regime or anything like that. There were a group within what was called the Wehrmacht in World War II. Wehrmacht, people, I think it means the army. It actually means the military. And there were different branches of the Wehrmacht, including the Luftwaffe, which was the Air Force, and the Hode, which was the army. Although I never hear that term used in World War II movies. I'm going up on the name for the Marine, for the Navy. But in any event, within the Wehrmacht, there was this group of elite soldiers, really, who were specifically trained to operate in Alpine territory. Alpine territory is very high elevated territory. Typically, it's very cold. It's snowing oftentimes. And so it's a very harsh climate or harsh environment in which to operate, especially when you're talking about military performance. So the United States and the European powers had, the Allies, I should say, had no such comparably trained troops. So the United States, for example, they had what in the Navy what were called at the time frogmen, which eventually became the SEALs. They had airborne troops like the 101st Airborne and the 82nd Airborne, and they had special training for parachuting and into a particular location, other things like that. They had glider-based troops as well, and the British, of course, had their commandos. But the commandos were somewhat like the U.S. frogmen in that they were doing sort of kind of covert military operations, but they had no troops specially trained like the Alpine Corps, or what was known as the Gebirgsjäger. My German's not particularly good. That the Wehrmacht created, and so that's why I'm using this example. That's why I'm using this example from the Wehrmacht in order to talk about these issues. For those of you, I guess, who think, well, we should never talk about military history from Germany in World War II. Okay, well, I guess you won't watch this episode, but I think we can learn from all aspects of history, and I will say that the recruitment and training that these soldiers went through was really quite extraordinary by any standard. And so um, their example, I think, can teach us quite a bit. So uh, and James Lucas, in the beginning of his book, he talks about how when the Wehrmacht leadership decided to create an Alpine Corps, it was done to operate in countries like those in Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and also in alpine areas of Austria. And the thinking was that um, they were going to need such specialized trained troops in order to be successful. Now, the interesting thing was that for much of their existence, the Gebirgsjäger, I should say, uh, did not fight in Alpine territory. So I think that while this is not a specific business lesson per se, I think one of the first things we can learn from the Gebirgsjäger is that don't create something unless you're really going to use it. There was a tremendous amount of time, energy, and money put into recruiting and training these men, and yet uh, very oftentimes their specialized training was of no use to them because they were fighting essentially like conventional soldiers. So especially in the early days of the formation of the Gebirgsjäger, the men who were recruited were those who had experience living and working in alpine country. So they were used to doing exhausting labor, if you will, in high elevation locations. Where now, why is that so taxing? Aside from the cold and the snow, the air is thinner, so it's harder to breathe. Or you need to essentially breathe more to get the same amount of oxygen, and there, the vegetation is different than at lower levels. Uh, Typically, it's rockier, so it's much more dangerous. And anything that you need, pretty much you have to be able to bring in with you. So, unlike conventional military forces, for the Gebirgsjäger, they couldn't just put massive artillery on a flat car for a train, for example, on the flat car of a train, I should say, and have the train pull it to where it was needed. Nor could they use, for the most part, motorized vehicles. They could not climb the kind of steep hills that they needed to climb. They couldn't operate effectively in the snow. So those kinds of mechanized military equipment was of no use to the Gebirgsjäger, and so they had to develop their own type of equipment that was, first of all, possible. It could be ported, through alpine territory. Number one, and number two, could operate in the cold, in the snow, in what were very unfavorable conditions just from the get go. So they used primarily small weapons, small arms, I should say, things like pistols, long guns, mortars, grenades, those kinds of sort of hand carried weapons, if you will. They had very little artillery, and like I said, they didn't have things like tanks and that sort of equipment. And so another lesson, I think, and before I get to my formal lessons that I worked out, another lesson that I think we can take from the Gebirgsjäger is that one can be successful even with somewhat rudimentary tools compared to what other competitors are using. If one is familiar enough with one's environment, if one has trained well in the use of the simpler technology, uh, there are times when that can make you more effective than having a lot of fancy technology that either is ill suited to what you're doing, or you and your team are not particularly well trained to use it. And so, therefore, you cannot be as effective with it as you could be with something that's simpler to use, or on which you're better trained, or is more in concert with the environment in which you're going to be operating. Now, in this case, when I say environment, I don't necessarily mean environment in terms of cold and ice and snow, like in the Alpine, but the market environment in which you're going to operate. So, just as kind of, an opening thoughts on this, I think there's rich mine here, that we can extract lessons from. And so, going through the book, I came up with, I think, 6 or 7 that I want to share with you. And the first one is, specialization yields a competitive advantage. So, uh, when you're focused on your niche, okay, then you can more easily dominate that niche. So earlier today, I was listening to a business podcast, and they were talking about Amazon moving more deeply into the grocery business. So currently, at least according to this podcast, Amazon controls roughly, I guess, 8% of the grocery business through its online grocery ordering and through its ownership of Whole Foods. Whereas the largest grocery supplier, Walmart, controls 30%, or maybe a little bit more than that, of the grocery business. So you can see that Amazon controls only a small part. And I think one of the reasons is Amazon is even less specialized than Walmart, which I would argue Walmart is not particularly specialized either. But Walmart has pursued the grocery business quite aggressively for at least, I think, a couple of decades now, right? So, looking at just the disparity between these two giant retailers, right, and how specialization has allowed Walmart to be dominant and leave Amazon in its dust, basically. So, the we, we we can take that same lesson and apply it to us who are not Walmart, or for that matter, even Amazon, at least in the grocery business, right? So the Gebirgsjäger, they had specialized training in Alpine warfare so that they could operate very effectively in the cold and the snow and the ice at these high elevations. And they trained in that kind of environment. And so it really gave them a tactical edge where the people against whom they fought just didn't have the same ability. So when they were in Norway, for example, although Norwegians in some way live in an alpine environment, okay, just living in the environment doesn't necessarily prepare someone to fight in that environment. Those are not the same thing. And so to be trained to husband animals in an alpine environment, for example, is a completely different thing than to be trained in combat in an alpine environment. And so when other forces had to engage with the Gebirgsjäger, they almost always lost because this Alpine elite unit had been specifically trained to operate in that environment. So, where we can see this happening in the business world, I think, in a more specific example than the one that I just gave, is a company like Patagonia. And Patagonia is a nice example for this because it's an outdoor company. It specializes in outdoor and alpine gear, and with a commitment to sustainability. That's kind of part of the ethos of that company. And because they have focused very strongly on being a dominant player in that business, or I'm sorry, in that area. So Patagonia has become one of the best known and most affected market competitors for outdoor clothing and equipment. Okay, and in fact, whereas a company like Adventure 16 went out of business here in Los Angeles several years ago now, I think REI has seen its footprint shrink, even though it was in a similar it was a similarly focused business, and other companies that are involved in it aren't really the kind of premium player that Patagonia is. I'm thinking of Dick's Sports and Big Five, for example. They're both sporting goods stores, and they sell gear that one can use in the outdoors, camping, that sort of thing. Patagonia is really focused on that area. It doesn't get into other sport or activity oriented areas, and so by being very focused, it's become, like I said, a dominant, if not the dominant player, or the dominant business in this area. And I think this is the reason I'm doing this first, is because I think this is one of the most important lessons that we can take from the Gebirgsjäger, is that in some ways, the smaller our business, the more important it is for us to focus on a narrow aspect of the business world. Okay, so we don't spread ourselves so thin, or we don't try to compete with companies that are much larger than we are and much better resourced than we are, right? So starting very focused is the best way to go. Once we gain a very significant presence in a particular area, then we can expand from there. So my business is an example of this. My professional fiduciary business, I focus solely on trust and estate administration, even though if you saw my show yesterday, I talked about the other aspects of professional fiduciary practice that my license would allow, in which my license would allow me to engage. I don't get involved in those areas of practice at all. I don't do conservatorships. I don't do guardianships. I focus solely on probate and trust administration. Okay, and as a result, it's an interesting phenomenon. I've been doing this for a few years now, and I was nominated basically to handle a probate that was being contested by two groups of heirs, and my lawyer reached out to the lawyer for the other side and said, "Hey, we'd like to bring in, Kevin Bemmel," or I should say, the lawyer for one side, who I happen to know, called me up and said, "Hey, would you be willing to, get involved in this situation? Here's what it's about." I said, that, it sounds like I can add value here, so yes, I will. I'll let you throw my hat in the ring, so to speak. And then he called up the other lawyer, and I didn't know the other lawyer at all. I've never met him, at least not that I recall. But in the conversation he had with my lawyer friend, he said, "Oh yeah, I know Kevin Bemmel by reputation, and I think we can work something out to bring him in so we can move this forward." Right. So the fact that I think in part of that reputation comes from my focus, and people who have heard of me, they know this is what I do. I don't get involved in other things, And so I've been able to build a presence in that niche. And so again, specialization yields competitive advantage. That's not only true for an elite alpine unit like the Gebirgsjäger, but it's crucial in business today, where there is so much noise, so many people, trying to do all kinds of things, that we need to be able to show people we're an expert in this one area. Okay, let's take a break. America is a maritime nation. Our freedom and security depend on strong sea services. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League stands with our Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Merchant Marine through community support, education, and advocacy. For over 120 years, Americans of all walks of life have heeded our call. No prior military service is required to join our mission. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League of the United States. Help us support those who serve at sea. Visit NavyLeague.org. So this is Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel. I'm talking about an elite Alpine unit that was part of the Wehrmacht in World War II, known as the Gebirgsjäger, and drawing lessons from this really unique unit. As I mentioned at the beginning of the show, the Allies did not have anything like this. They did have some specialized units, but nothing in the Alpine territory. So I talked about the importance of specialization because it yields a competitive advantage. So let's look at some other aspects or some other lessons that we can learn from the Gebirgsjäger. So one of the hallmarks of this elite unit was its adaptability in hostile conditions. So I've mentioned already that they operated in an extreme environment: cold, snow, rock, ice, steep, grades that they had to navigate, and as a result, even today, there's not a whole lot of equipment that can be brought into such an environment, and so the Gebirgsjäger had to really maintain optimal performance with limited supplies, limited equipment in this very harsh environment. Okay, and they specifically trained to do that. So, for the most part, what they only had to use, eat, etc., fight with that which they could carry themselves, either carry on their back or slung over their shoulder or something like that. Now, in some cases, they had some pack animals, but in the most extreme situations, they didn't even have animals that could help them transport equipment or food, and so they had to be they had to rely only on themselves as a team, basically, in order to be able to navigate and fight effectively in the harsh alpine environment. So not that the business environment is necessarily as harsh as an alpine environment. However, it is the case that business is very competitive. And while various innovations were supposed to make business easier, more accessible for more people, while the internet, for example, certainly has done that, has made certain things easier and has made marketing more accessible to more people, in the end, it hasn't made business success easier. In fact, I would argue, has made business more competitive, and therefore it's made being successful more challenging, because with more competitors, among other things, it's a lot harder to break through and create a situation where people know about you and your business. So an example, and I've used this example in other shows, but it really stands out, is Netflix. So I was a Netflix user early on when it was a mail DVD service. you would go and tell you'd go online and basically choose the DVDs you wanted sent to you. They'd be mailed to you. You had a certain amount of time to watch them. You put them back in an envelope and mailed them back. And that was how Netflix got started. And the leadership team at Netflix was quite prescient in seeing that down the road, streaming was going to become the dominant way that people consumed content. And so, at a time when Blockbuster was the dominant player in recorded viewing, i.e., DVDs, and to a lesser extent, and VHS cassettes and laser discs. Uh, Netflix made what looked like a huge gamble at the time, switching to streaming, even though they they knew pretty certainly that streaming was going to cannibalize their existing DVD business. But it turned out to be not just the right decision; it was the brilliantly right decision to adapt to a very uh, rapidly changing, highly competitive media distribution and creation environment. So first, Netflix shifted over into streaming early on, and then after that, they actually got into content creation, and now Netflix is, I believe, the largest media company in the world. It dwarfs even huge companies like the Walt Disney Company, and I think it's called Skydance Paramount now that the latest merger has closed. So, and prior, when Netflix got started, it was nothing in terms of market cap or impact on the market. So its ability to adapt and to make the changes that are necessary to keep at the forefront of the market have made it the most relevant media company in the world. I would add that most recently, perhaps, is Netflix and their streaming service. They did not have an ad supported model, but I think several years ago they realized that they were going to have to adapt further. That as more and more streaming players entered into the marketplace and had ad supported uh, varieties of their streaming services, which let them offer them at a lower monthly price. So Netflix was going to have to compete with that, and so they created an ad supported tier that was much less much less expensive than their non ad supported tier. And although their ad revenue got off to a pretty slow start, the ad supported tier at Netflix has grown tremendously, as has the revenue that Netflix gets from advertising. And so again, you see the ability of Netflix to adapt in what is a hostile market conditions in the business world. Okay. Next is leadership by example builds cohesion. So the fact of the matter is, especially today, leaders need to be willing to share, in essence, the hardships of their teams so as to foster trust and loyalty. And again, the Gebirgsjäger, you see this. You also see this in most elite combat teams. The SEALs, I know personally because I was a command chaplain for a SEAL team. The officers work very closely with their men. They lead from the front. They operate and endure the same conditions as the so-called rank and file. It's a little bit, I think, of a misnomer to think of elite troops as rank and file, but they all endure the same conditions. They eat the same food. They carry the same burdens. at least the same physical burdens. And then the officers carry, of course, the burden of command in addition. So that was the ethos of the Gebirgsjäger, as it is with, like, again, most elite combat troops. So an example of this, an event that I actually took a part in when I was in the Navy, was during the earthquake and the subsequent tsunami in Japan in 2011. So among the companies that were impacted was Toyota, the automaker, and their operations were significantly disrupted. And so the leadership of Toyota had a kind of a fundamental choice to make, and that was, do we just issue instructions to the rank and file employees, directing them how to get the company up and operating again, back on its feet? Or do we sort of, roll up our sleeves and get in there with them and, in essence, share the same experience of rebuilding, of frustration, of trying to of figuring out what needs to be done and how it can be done, how it can be accomplished most effectively? And the leadership of Toyota chose the latter, and as a result, they were able to restore operations more quickly. Number one, which of course was important to the company itself, but also they were able to strengthen employee morale and supplier relationships by showing that everyone in the company was committed to getting it back on its feet. And so anytime a company faces a crisis or a particularly big challenge, I think it's very important that leadership demonstrate to the team members that they're willing to take on the same burdens and take the hits to the quality of their life that they're asking their people to take in order to overcome whatever this large challenge, this problem is. Okay, so leadership by example certainly builds cohesion. Okay, next, invest in training and preparation. So, uh, I've already talked a little bit about how the Gebirgsjäger underwent very intensive training. So, despite, at least in the initial months and year or two of the Gebirgsjäger, the um, the men recruited to be a part of this elite unit were used to working in an alpine environment. So despite having that background, if you will, they were still given very rigorous, specific training to operate on a combat basis in the alpine environment. So while they were many, if not all of them, were very accomplished skiers, snowshoers, and that sort of thing, which is among the modes of transportation when you're at high elevations with snow and such. They didn't necessarily have training in demolition, in combat, those sorts of military activities. And so, in order to make them effective as an elite combat group or team, they needed specialized training that allowed them to be ready for a very high level of performance. And the same is true in our businesses. So there is no such thing as enough training. We should be looking for training opportunities on a continual basis. So, and not just for ourselves, of course, but for our people. And in some ways, it's even more important for our people, because one of the ways I think that we can generate loyalty from our team members is by showing them, not letting them know, but actually showing them we will invest in their improving their knowledge, their skills, their abilities, and that we do that freely with the sole purpose of creating more opportunity for them. Now, of course, we want them to, hopefully they'll exercise that opportunity within our organization to improve its performance. But in any event, we want to show our people that we will invest in them. So, and a company that does this, is known for doing this, is McKinsey and Company, the consultancy. So they have very structured training and mentorship programs. All of it is designed to not just create the image, but the reality that McKinsey people are highly skilled, highly knowledgeable, very experienced, and so they will deliver very high quality service, and they will help the businesses with which they consult operate in ever higher levels of performance, right? So if the McKinsey people were known as schleppers, which is a good Yiddish word, it sounds like what it means is that they just really, they're really not at the top of their game, right? Then why would a company that's looking to improve itself hire them? So the reality is, we want to be, and we want our team members to be, at the very top training. Now, of course, they can't be training all the time, right? There would be no one to actually make the business run. But still, periodic training, investing in training, keeping our people at peak readiness so that when the inevitable challenges arise, they can respond to them, is a very, very wise investment on our part. And it is, again, another lesson we can learn from the Gebirgsjäger. Okay, lesson number 5. Cultural, we need to be culturally and environmentally intelligent. So understanding the operating environment is crucial to success. Now, I've raised this issue before in other episodes of Business Lessons from the Military, but it bears repeating. And the business environment is rarely as harsh as operating at thousands of feet elevation in the cold, ice, snow, etc., with limited amount of equipment. Business is rarely like that today. However, when we're getting started, when we don't have a lot of resources to buy fancy equipment, and maybe all we can afford is a computer, a cell phone. I'm pointing my cell phone over here that's in the charger, a printer scanner, right? That if that's the only equipment that we can afford, so then how are we going to operate successfully? And one way we can compensate for the inability to have sophisticated equipment is by being as culturally and environmentally aware as possible. And that goes back for the Gebirgsjäger. That goes back to the kind of knowledge that many of the early members of this elite unit brought with them, because they were used to operating in this harsh environment. Okay, so they came with a background in it, and then the training that I spoke about just a moment ago improved their environmental and cultural awareness and intelligence for operating in that environment. And so, we may not be able to afford to hire experienced business people into our company, into our organization. That's fine. But then we need to be willing to invest in their training, and not just in the training they need to know how to do their job, the sort of fundamentals of doing their job. We also need to invest so that they understand the business environment in which the company operates, and who are the competitors. How might they be able to outcompete us? How can we better understand who our customers are, who our clients are, what the challenges may be in the economy that with which we'll have to deal, that we'll have to overcome. So creating that level of cultural and environment intelligence is another aspect of the training, okay? But it can pay big dividends. So for example, Unilever is well known for tailoring products for the specific markets in which it operates. So it looks to tailor flavors of foods, for example, to specific markets, as opposed to, and this is not knocking Hershey's company, but Hershey's chocolate has a very distinctive taste to it. And I mean, I happen to like it. I grew up eating Hershey's chocolate. And if you eat Hershey's chocolate and another, large sort of everyday chocolate maker like Nestle's, you'll see very different taste. The taste is homogenous no matter where you go in the world. Okay. And that's part of the hallmark of Hershey's. Okay. Whereas other companies will tailor the flavor of their products to specific markets. Okay. And in that way, they attract local customers. So um, I just lost the example that I was going to use for that. Oh, shoot. Uh, uh, I think Starbucks, if I remember correctly, they tailor their beverages to local tastes. So the flavors that are available in China or India are different than those available in the United States. Okay, so by taking advantage of, or by learning about the various cultures and environments in which our company operates, we can we can make a fundamental decision. Are we looking to acclimate customers and clients to our product, or are we going to tailor our products or even services to the tastes, wants, needs of a particular market or sub-market? Okay, so cultural and environmental intelligence, very important. And then finally, um, elite status requires constant reinforcement. So if we're going to create an elite team, okay, in business or in the military, it's not a one-off thing. It's not we train them to peak performance and then move on with our day. Not at all. So in the Gebirgsjäger, and this was one of the problems that they faced, is because over the time of their existence, they did not operate in the alpine environment the way they had been trained, but operated more like conventional troops. It became increasingly difficult for the Gebirgsjäger to maintain a sense of elite status. Okay, and the same is true for our businesses. Once we hit the pinnacle of the area in which we operate, whether it's a product or in a service area, we can't take it for granted that now that we're there, we're going to stay there. We have to keep in mind that there are going to be competitors whose sole objective is going to be to knock us off that peak, right? And so to maintain that elite status, we have to constantly be reinforcing the idea to our people. And it's not just enough to keep to do training. So training is important, and gathering cultural and environmental intelligence is important. But the most important aspect of that is the reinforcement of the message that we want to be the top competitor in our market. We want to be the elite. If we are not continually demonstrating our commitment to holding that position, eventually we're going to fall from that position. So those are the lessons that I drew from James Lucas's book, Alpine Elite, about the Gebirgsjäger. this elite Alpine combat unit in the Wehrmacht during World War II. And I think that we are well advised. The smaller our business is, the more important it is for us to adapt our mindset to the idea of creating an elite team that is specialized, very focused on a particular niche to become successful and dominant in that niche. And then we can move on from there. So I thank you very much for joining me today, especially my live viewers. I always like to give them a hello. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, People Making Money. And then this week on Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific time is my every other week show, Jiggers' Place. We'll have a cocktail and a schmooze, and we'll relax a little bit as we head in toward the end of the week. And then next week on Monday at 10 a.m. is my show, Trusts and Estates Weekly. And then, of course, a week from today, I'll be back with the next episode of Business Lessons from the Military. So again, thank you so much for joining me. If you like what you watched or heard on this show, tell a friend. I'd love to have the opportunity to gain them as a viewer or listener or subscriber, and would very much appreciate you giving me that opportunity. So again, thank you so much for joining me. Hoping to see you again this week. And signing off as I always do, Marie darling, you are my belle. Courage at all times.